Let's get this over with, shall we? Atonement. So what? Well. Alright. So, Atonement. After reading Cyril Connolly's letter to Bryony, her correspondence with Nettle, and her contemplations throughout the last part of the book, it's revealed to the reader that the story we just read was actually the final revised draft of a story Bryony wrote. This letter back from Cyril Connolly gives her feedback on what it seems as though was her first, or one of her first drafts that she chose to submit to the magazine, because in it he talks about her story having only described the scene from the fountain between Cecilia and Robbie and the vase, and nothing really happened. So the fact that we just read a story, additional information, action, tells us that it was one of her first drafts that she submitted. So we know that we read her story, but the question is just how much of Atonement is really just two figures by a fountain? It's difficult to make out fact from fiction. We know the story that we just read by Bryony was indeed her final draft, because in London 99, when we are sure that it is truly Bryony's thoughts that we are reading about, she says there would be no further drafts on page 340. She also says, it is only in this last version that my lovers end well, page 350. And that is indeed what happens. They are still alive when Bryony's walking away from them, standing together on the pavement. So yeah, it's hard to tell where exactly Bryony's story begins and ends being told. In many ways, reading Atonement is like Hamlet. It's a Build-A-Bear plot. It's like this. These diagrams in which every time you have to decide whether to believe something really did truly happen or not, it leads you on to a different storyline. With this being said, the postmodern nature of the book is very minimalist in the sense that it is left up to the reader's imagination to shape the story. McEwan purposely rarely makes definite factual statements. It is up to us to take an active role in the creative process of the story. Just like how in Barry Burke's article, Phil Cohen said that oftentimes in postmodern stories just like this one, McEwan juggles around trying to keep as many ideas in the air at once as it can. And this is exactly what he does. There are many loose ends to almost every version of the story, meaning that there is no one correct plot line, there is no one truthful story. The whole plot itself, the whole storyline, is a collection of mutable truths. It is up to us to choose what to believe and disbelieve in comprehending the novel. Essentially, this story is a language game that Leotard talks about within his article. McEwan is the sender, and we, the readers, are the addressees, and we are constantly trying to grasp the referent, being the story, and denotate it, correctly identify it and pin it down for what it is. We're trying to grasp something that is insubstantial, because there are so many different possible pathways you can take when trying to understand this story that Atonement becomes what we want it to. But in the last part of the novel, London 99, Bryony says that her 59-year assignment is over, meaning she's referring to this story, which she spent 59 years editing until this final draft we just read was produced. And you wonder why. It makes you think, why did she spend 59 years writing a book? Which is why I think the story she wrote, Two Figures by a Fountain, assuming it is still called that, was an extension of what really happened. She also reveals that in real life, Cecilia and Robbie both died in 1940, which makes you wonder why she have them remain living on in her story. I personally choose to believe that the story she wrote is a mixture of truths and lies. It's hard to make out truth from lies. However, in Bryony's story, or what we think was Bryony's story, Cecilia and Robbie exchanged letters between them while Robbie was in the war. And then in London 99, Bryony tells us that the letters the lovers wrote are in the archives of the War Museum. So it's as if aspects of the story are real, but no one can be sure. In London 1999, she reveals a couple of things that didn't happen in the story that did in real life. First is that Robbie and Cecilia actually died in 1940, yet in the story, past that time, they are still alive and happily together. for the time being. Bryony going to visit her sister and Robbie. That never actually happened, and if she had, only Cecilia would have been there because Robbie was already dead. A couple things can be confirmed. Robbie went to war, Cecilia didn't, and then Robbie died, and Cecilia was separated from him, and they never met again. I believe that the initial founding scene was real, and she just added on to this real story, almost as if she's dedicating it to them. She wrote her first draft based off of this, sent it into the magazine company, received the letter back from Cyril Connolly with his suggestions, and we know that she got the letter during her time working as a nurse. In London 1999 portion of the book, Bryony tells us that she wrote the earliest version January 1940, the second draft in June 1947. Now, we can infer that at the time when she received the letter from Cyril Connolly while she was working as a nurse, she had only written the first draft because it wouldn't have been 1947 by then, and we know that it was a very early draft that she had sent into the magazine. By 1947, she would have known that Robbie and Cecilia were both dead as they had died in 1940. Now, having written the first draft in January 1940, we know that that would have been before Cecilia and or Robbie had died. This would have been around the time when she had already realized that she had wrongly accused Robbie of raping Lola. So perhaps she wrote Three Figures by a Fountain from three different perspectives as a representation of her growing awareness that she is not always the correct one and that there may be multiple truths. The fact that there are different perspectives on something is analogous to how there are different views on how Lola was abused and who did it. However, I believe that the fountain scene did in fact occur, but then she extended the story as a way to atone for the crime she committed forever and ever, because a book will always be there. She would have felt the urge to write a book, especially because by the year 1947, she wouldn't have been able to go seek forgiveness from Robbie or Cecilia because they would have been dead by then. So it makes sense that she would have written the rest of the book as though dedicated to them after they were dead. Which leads me to a point. One of the biggest ways, I'm an egg. Oh my god. The fact that she spent 59 years writing this book just goes to show that the purpose of fabricating a story with an alternate, more positive ending, one that Bryony believed should have happened if it weren't for her, is her way of atoning, not forgiving herself, but trying to infinitely forever make up for what she did. We see her atone for his sin, whether it be real or fabricated. Besides writing her novel, which will last forever, she will be atoning forever for something that can never be forgiven, right? Is how Bryony gave up her spot at Cambridge. She gave up her passion to become a nurse. It says on page 287 that she came the closest she would ever be to the battlefield. She sacrifices her education, turns down the opportunity to follow her passion to become a nurse, something she doesn't seem well suited for and that we know she isn't very good at. Bryony places herself in a position that is, in relation to the meta-narrative being the war effort, her position is as similar as possible to the two people she hurt the most from her crime, that being having wrongly accused Robbie of rape, Cecilia and Robbie. In doing so, she humbles herself so that she can exist at the same level as those who were most afflicted by her mistake. In a way, this allows her to empathize with their pain and torture herself in an attempt to atone for what she knows is unforgivable. She even says it in London 1999. We know that she does not forgive herself, presumably, what? She says, I was not so self-serving as to let them forgive me. So if this story is so confusing, why read it? Having been written with minimalism in mind, this story communicates an important message that resonates with us in our everyday lives. Besides the fact that this story is a great reflection of the postmodern world that we live in, reading it, the decisions we make while trying to understand the story help us gain insight on the things we choose to believe and disbelieve in our everyday lives. It helps us become conscious of the truths we choose to ignore, of the micro-narratives we are supporting. But aside from all that, McEwen is providing us with an important message. He is expressing the fragility of life and how some actions have consequences that cannot be undone. So it is important that we remain conscious of that. Okay. Some things in life, the impacts are just too big to ever make up for. The storyline itself is the biggest example of this lesson. Simply the way that, Bryony came between two lovers and separated them, prevented them from allowing to explore their love for each other, and then having them die apart, all because she was too naive to even consider the fact that she could actually be wrong. She had forgotten to consider the fact that there are such things as immutable truths, that she's not the only correct person, that there are other people who exist. Other people are experiencing the world just as she is, or affected by her actions, that they're just as alive as her, and yet she fails to keep this in mind when she accuses Robbie of rape without any hesitation. And the poem worked into the story helps emphasize the deliverance and impact this message has on the reader from McEwan. One element of postmodernism is the irony in how, prior to having sent Robbie to jail, Bryony had the epiphany while looking at her finger that, oh wow, there are other people in the world. Other people around her exist, and that she's not the only one alive. She says on page 34, was everyone else really as alive as she was? She knew it was overwhelmingly probable that everyone else had thoughts like hers. And the irony in this is that she had this realization before having accused Robbie of raping Lola. To have realized this before and then not take it into consideration when making such a bold accusation is ironic. The swiftness with which she completely turns around Robbie and Cecilia's life just goes to show that actions have consequences, and it's important that you are conscious of them. You're aware of this because an impactful decision, impactful action, just like Bryony's, can be made so fast that you need to be aware of it beforehand to even prevent it from happening, or else it will have long-lasting effects. Sometimes everlasting, just like how Cecilia and Robbie will forever be separated and dead. The use of faction, how the combination of, we assume so, fictional story with the factual World War II that occurred, and how the two interact in the story, again, emphasizes the heft, the weight of her actions, Bryony's mistake. The fact that Robbie and C are separated by a war emphasizes the divide Bryony drove between them. Being a factual event, we have knowledge as to how horrible World War II was. This is also an example of intertextuality, right? For World War II to come between Cecilia and Robbie quite literally symbolizes the great divide that Bryony caused between them, and just how horribly impactful Bryony's actions were between them. Like the amount of harm that took place in World War II, it's so analogous to the impact that your actions can have, and just how severe the consequences can be of some, mindless accusation. The fact that McEwan chose to write this book during the time of World War II goes to show how he's trying to demonstrate the fragility of life, right? So many people died in World War II. Yeah, life, relationships, everything that comes along with life is something to be cherished and handled carefully with hazard. Atonement is written having spanned multiple literary eras, from Victorian to postmodern writing styles, but Bryony's thoughts and maturity progress in the same way. The book is written beginning in a Victorian style all the way to a postmodern style. Similarly, Bryony's thoughts and maturity progress like this. At the beginning of the novel, Bryony's perspective is much like that of the modern era associated with the Enlightenment, which Mary Clay just talked about. During the European Enlightenment, which the modern era expanded from, there is universal truth. There is one truth. There is order and disorder. Everything is very black or white. Things are or they are not. There is no in between. And this is like Bryony's perspective in the beginning of the book. She sees things only from her point of view, and everything has to be a certain way or else it's wrong. And this aligns correctly with modernity and the European Enlightenment. Oh my god. Even just the way her dolls are arranged inside their playhouse is an example. Even just the way her straight-back dolls in their many-roomed mansion appeared to be under strict instructions not to touch the walls in her room is an example of this. We then see her later on realize that there are other people around her, as I talked about before, but she doesn't actually put this realization into use because she still accuses Robbie of rape. Then later on in the novel, once the writing style has more so shifted into postmodernism, while Bryony's working as a nurse, she says that she learned a simple thing. A person is, among all else, a material thing, easily torn, not easily mended. Now, this ties into postmodernism because, I just popped my shoulder back into place. Okay, Mary Cleges says that postmodernism is the awareness that meta-narratives exist to mask the disorders, the micro-narratives. It shows that she has become aware of the micro-narrative beneath the meta-narrative. Meta-narrative being the wartime effort, and the micro-narrative being the humans that lie underneath it. And all at once, she is thinking with a postmodern mindset, which aligns with the literary era that the book is being written in at this point. And it demonstrates she has matured a lot more, how she has realized the heft, the weight of her actions, how careful you must be, how your actions have consequences, and it is not easy to mend. Both the war and her own actions have demonstrated that humans are very delicate things, and we must be very, very careful when handling them because, like I said before, you can't undo all things. What else? Another way to look at it is that she had been existing in her own micro-narrative. Just from her perspective, it was the life she lived and the one that only she lived in. And now she's come to see that this micro-narrative of hers had been bleeding out into the meta-narrative of those around her. In realizing that those around her had been impacted by her actions, she's become conscious of how she had been part of the disordered portion of society, that there had been a meta-narrative surrounding her micro-narrative that had been, for a little bit of time, bleeding out into the meta-narrative, but thankfully, later the meta-narrative squandered it. McEwen again expresses the fragility of life through Bryony when on the last page she says that in writing the story as an attempt to atone for her crime, it was always an impossible task, and that was precisely the point. The attempt was all, meaning that she will forever be trying to gain forgiveness for what she did, yet it is impossible, meaning that her mistake cannot be undone. And this is actually an example of poemena. Bryony, within the story that McEwen is writing, is referring to the piece that she wrote as a piece of atonement. And in referring to this book, she says that she's referring to the process of her writing it over 58 years, that it was an impossible task. The vase throughout this novel symbolizes relationships, most notably the one between Cecilia and Robbie, because the protagonist, Bryony, is the one who broke it. The vase, or the Meissen porcelain vase at the beginning of the book, but what might have actually been a Ming vase, we're not really sure, of course, again. But the fact that it's impossible to know for sure whether the vase actually broke, and if it did break, who broke it. But just taking the story we read at face value, the vase breaking symbolizes the broken relationship and or future bond between Cecilia and Robbie due to Bryony's horrible accusation of him. The fact that once a vase is completely broken, crumbled, that it can't be mended is analogous to how Bryony's mistake cannot be undone. Just as you can't glue a million pieces of a vase back together, you cannot mend some relationships you break. The fact that it's a vase that was broken is significant because vases are fragile and delicate, just like human life is, and everything associated with human life. All right, that's it. Peace. I'm so done. One more thing. Throughout the novel, there seems to be a reoccurring symbol, or I guess motif. There are a couple times throughout the story in which Bryony is standing at a window. First is on page 35, when she first observes the fountain scene. It says, she had arrived at one of the nursery's wide open windows and must have seen what lay before her. Then the second time is while she's working as a nurse, and it says that on her free time, she would drift along the corridor to a stairwell where a window gave a view of the river, and she would look out. And then the last time is right at the very end. She tells us, I've been standing at the window. This is on the very last page. So just a theory, perhaps the window, her standing from the window overlooking things, symbolizes how Bryony was the writer of the story we just read, and how from a window you can overlook and see what is happening below you. A writer is able to oversee what is happening in the plot she is creating. I don't know, I'm not sure what else it could signify. But yeah, that's a theory. Something I noticed. Alright, what is this even called? What are we doing? Ah. Is it look? Wow. My head hurts.